Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
The grill hissed like a tired dragon while the lawn chairs sank into the soft ground and the paper lanterns bobbed against a sky that could not decide between late spring and early summer, and I stood with a plastic cup that tasted faintly like soap, watching my sister hold court beside a platter of corn that never learned the meaning of butter. When Mom tapped her fork on a plate for attention and sang out in that bright voice she keeps for announcements that include price tags and praise, telling the circle that her golden child had finally closed on a house, and then she turned her smile on me and asked when I would finally settle down, as if the question were a harmless balloon and not a pin aimed dead center at my patience. So I smiled and said I already did. I just did not invite anyone who counted me out, and the fork slipped from her hand and made the soft, indecent sound of a truth landing. I did not raise my voice because I learned a long time ago that quiet travels farther than noise, and the quiet that followed rippled across the yard in a way that made even the citronella candles hold their breath. And Haley laughed a little too high and told me not to be dramatic because we were just celebrating, but there was that thin line between her eyes that shows up when a bill is larger than expected. And the line made me want to hand her a level and a calculator and wish her luck. Because if there is one thing the universe loves, it is a discounted dream that leaks in the rain. Dad cleared his throat in the heavy way that means he is about to steer the conversation back to the safe harbor of sports or weather, yet he glanced at me over the rim of his glass with the old, familiar mixture of caution and curiosity. Like a man approaching a dog that he cannot decide is friendly or fed up, and I took another sip and tasted the years in it, the aftertaste of being the kid who packed her own lunch, bought her own shoes, and learned to park in the far lot because no one saved her a space near the front door. When I said I had already settled down, I did not mean it as a gunshot or a trumpet. I meant it as a door I had already closed with both hands, and a kind of relief that borders on prayer, because there is a ceremony to doing something alone and living to tell it. And in the weeks after I signed papers and pressed the cool head of the pen into my initials, I learned the hymn of a house's first night, where the refrigerator hum is a lullaby and the bare floors answer footsteps with hollow honesty. And you can hear your own decisions echo without anyone shouting their opinions over them. Haley tilted her head and asked where this invisible castle of mine might be, rolling the word cute around like a mint that had gone stale, and I said only that it has a porch light that knows me, a kettle that sings the note I like, and a neighbor who brings over cuttings when the moon is right, and Aunt Joan chuckled and said that sounded like poetry and also like code for something I did not want to share, which, for the record, was both true and necessary, because I do not mind telling the truth. I just prefer not to serve it to people who season it with doubt. Mom recovered quickly, because she always does, the way a cat does when it slips off a counter and pretends it had urgent business on the floor anyway, and she said that of course we would have celebrated my place if we had known, which landed about as gently as a receipt slapped on a table after dessert, and I nodded and let the nod say everything it needed to, like how they had known the color of Haley's backsplash before she did and the square footage of her dreams down to the closet, while my milestones passed by unnoticed, smaller fireworks exploding in an empty field. I raised my cup and asked for a toast, but I kept it brief and almost kind, because kindness is sharper when it is honest, and I said here is to new keys and old habits, to roofs that hold and to walls that remember, and to learning, finally, that a guest list is a love letter to yourself, and a few cousins laughed without meaning to while Haley's boyfriend examined his shoes as if they might speak, and somewhere behind the trellis a phone chimed, because phones are loyal only to the person holding them. What I did not say out loud was that my bag under the picnic table held a small white box for Mom, and inside the box was a set of engraved coasters I had ordered weeks ago, smooth stone with a simple line of text that read for the daughter who invites herself, which is a joke if you are generous and a small blade if you are not, and when the conversation drifted toward mortgage rates and interest as if those were neutral weather patterns and not personal weather systems, I slid the box onto Mom's lap with a smile that could pass for peace, and she opened it and stared, and I watched the message travel from her hands to her eyes and then bounce around the years like a pinball, lighting up memories where I had shown up, paid up, stood up, and still been treated like a guest in my own life. I do not enjoy revenge the way some people enjoy cake. I enjoy it the way a runner enjoys the first breath after a long hill, and while they resumed talking, I set my phone on the arm of the chair and cued a message that had been sitting in drafts for exactly 1 week. A simple, cheerful invitation sent to neighbors, coworkers, and the few friends who remembered my birthdays without reminders, telling them that tonight, after dusk, my porch light would be on for an open house that was not about selling anything, and as I hit send, I turned down the screen and let the lawn lights take over, and I felt the familiar tug of guilt and the equally familiar truth that guilt is not a compass, it is a leash. Mom asked softly whether I was serious about the house or just being theatrical, because sometimes I tilt toward one when the other would be easier, and I told her I had never been more practical in my life. That I had measured rooms with the care people reserve for measuring their patients, that paint on my cuticle is not a fashion choice, and that I had learned the language of water shutoffs and breaker boxes the way some people memorize baby names. And she smiled a brittle smile, the kind that leaves crumbs, and nodded as if the matter were settled, though we both knew nothing was settled at all. I stood to take a dish to the kitchen and pass Dad, who said in a low voice that if I ever needed help with anything, I should just ask, and I almost laughed because asking has a shelf life. And mine expired somewhere between college tuition pep talks and the day my car died, and the only jumper cables in sight were metaphors, and I told him I was all set for now, but I appreciated it. And I meant the part about appreciation even if the rest felt like an aftertaste of something I had quit eating. Back outside, I placed my empty cup beside the stack of plates and noticed one coaster already sitting under Mom's glass, the words face down as if turning them over might change what they said, and I felt the smallest flare of satisfaction. Not because I hurt her, but because the message landed, and as Haley held up her keys and everyone clapped on cue, I caught my reflection in the sliding door and saw a woman who had quietly stepped out of the line where she was supposed to wait, and as the first porch lights in the neighborhood blinked awake, my phone hummed with a string of yes for later tonight, and I tucked it into my pocket, knowing that in a few hours a different table would be set and different laughter would rise, and that this, right here, was only the first turn of the key, because the real delivery had not arrived yet, and when it did, Dad's smile would not survive it. By the time the paper plates began to bow under the weight of overcooked ribs and the sun slipped to that tired angle where every shadow looks like a choice you did not make, the performance of congratulations for my sister had reached its predictable crescendo. With uncles repeating mortgage advice they read in a glossy pamphlet and neighbors who barely knew her nodding like dashboard toys, and I stood near the folding tables that have been hauled to every family gathering since the era of disposable cameras, thinking about how many birthdays I spent clearing those surfaces while someone else unwrapped gifts bought with the same checkbook that somehow never found my address, and the thought arrived with the dry, steady calm of a ledger closing. I had spent years paying attention to people who did not pay attention back, and I had finally built a life that did not require their receipts. When people talk about favoritism, they often frame it as a feeling, a bruise that fades if you do not poke it. Yet in our house it was a practice with inventory numbers. Because Mom kept a mental warehouse where Haley's needs were always marked urgent while mine were sorted into the category called valuable if self-funded, and I learned to live as a line item, which is a harsh education but also a clean one, since it teaches you that the most efficient path from wanting to having is work, the unglamorous kind that happens after everyone else goes home. So when I say that I chose my porch light over their applause, I mean that I looked at the balance sheet of my history with them and wrote down the honest total, then changed the locks on my expectations. In the summers when we were still almost kids and the map of who we would become had not been drawn in permanent marker, I remember Dad sanding those same folding tables on the driveway and telling us that would shows what the hands that touch it believe. And Haley had laughed and said she believed in being the guest of honor, which earned her a kiss on the head and the promise that she would be, while I traced the grain with a fingertip and believed in being invited at all, a small belief that hardened into a habit once college arrived and the tuition conversation turned into a sermon about bootstrap culture, and I learned to make friends with overtime, secondhand furniture, and the kind of landlords who pronounce your name like a chore. Until slowly the overtime became savings, the savings became the vocabulary of inspections and appraisals, and the vocabulary became a key that felt heavy in the best way, a small weight that said you did this, and you did not need to ask permission. The laughter around me swelled as Haley performed another anecdote about negotiating the price of a refrigerator, as if haggling were a spiritual practice and not a symptom of buying more square footage than wisdom. And somewhere in the middle of that story, she made eye contact with me, quick and sharp, the way people glance at mirrors to confirm they still exist, and she raised her glass with a smile that contained more calculation than cheer. So I raised mine back with a smile that contained exactly as much history as necessary and no more, and then I reached under the buffet to test the hinge on the nearest table, feeling the old wobble that always appears under the weight of other people's happiness. And a very simple scheme assembled itself quietly, the way a picture emerges from a puzzle you have done enough times to forget you know by heart. I told Mom that I could take 2 tables when I left because I needed them for some friends coming by later, a sentence that sounded helpful even though it wore the suit of a confession. And she nodded with the distracted approval of someone who believes they have already won the day, and Dad helped me fold the legs while talking about the rising cost of lumber as if the topic were a lullaby. And I waited for the right moment to say that it would be easier if I also grabbed the permanent markers from the junk drawer, because we might label serving dishes to make cleanup simple, and the words slid through the kitchen without resistance, since trust is the laziest muscle in families like ours. And there on the counter lay a handful of fat silver markers that have signed a lifetime of poster boards and school projects for the child who is never me. By dusk my small house was alive in a way I had not heard since the kind of birthdays that happened before disappointment grows teeth, with coworkers who had stayed late to help hang the second-hand curtains pointing out the soft glow of the porch light like it was a new moon, neighbors carrying plates of desserts with recipes they swore were foolproof, and the kind of friends who show up with folding chairs, which is the truest currency of affection in this country, and I set up those 2 family tables in the living room and explained that before we placed a single bowl, I wanted everyone who felt like it to sign the underside the way carpenters sign beams, to leave a sentence or a name or a wish. Because I was tired of surfaces that only remembered other people, and the markers whispered across the old plywood like rain on a roof, leaving messages that did not try to be profound, just honest. We were here, you were worth the trip. This home owes nothing to anyone who forgot your address. When the plates were cleared and the kettles sang, and the last toast hovered somewhere between gratitude and gallows humor, I flipped each table to let the ink dry and brushed a thin sealant across the messages with the care my family historically reserved for my sister's good china, and then, while everyone argued gently about whether pie is breakfast, I slid the tables back into my trunk with a patience that felt ceremonial, knowing that I would return them tomorrow morning as spotless as ever, the tops wiped to a shine, the memory of their service invisible in all the usual places, yet underneath, holding like timber in a storm. A quiet chorus of signatures and sentences that would shout the moment Mom unfolded a leg at the next holiday and caught the silver handwriting winking in the light, a permanent record of a night she was not invited to because she had never really invited me. It was a petty flourish executed with the grace of a ledger correction, a soft revenge that did not bruise anyone's skin but would live in their palms every time they flattened the hinges and felt the table breathe. And when I parked outside my house again to carry in the last tray, my phone chimed with a message from Dad thanking me for helping with cleanup and mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that he had finally opened the mail I had sent last week and planned to show it to Mom in the morning because it looked important, a line that landed like a match on dry grass, since the envelope did not contain a greeting card or a coupon or anything apparent files under miscellaneous. And as I set the tray on the counter and listened to the quiet settle over my rooms like a blanket that knew my name, I understood that the evening had only been the prologue to the real chapter. The one in which a polite man unfolds a piece of paper at the kitchen table and discovers that every calculation he has ever made about who I am has a decimal point in the wrong place. Morning arrived with a kind of thin, rinsed light that makes even tired countertops look like they are trying. And while the coffee moved from stubborn to loyal, I stood in my quiet kitchen with the folding tables, leaned neatly against the wall, and read the names that had dried in thin silver lines beneath them, letting the memory of last night's laughter settle into something sturdier than noise, because there is a difference between being surrounded and being held, and for the first time in a long stretch of years, I felt held by people whose expectations do not require costume changes, deposit slips, or gratitude that must be performed on cue. So I opened the back door to let the morning in and imagine the next move, the way a chess player regards the board after finally rescuing a trapped piece, knowing that the best victories are rarely loud, they are simply undeniable. I drove the tables back to my parents' place before anyone besides the neighbor who power walks like purpose itself was awake, carried them to the garage in the hush that garages keep for secrets about family history, and left a small thank you note on the potting bench that used to be my science fair headquarters, a simple line about borrowing and returning, because I wanted the tops to look untouched while the undersides carried their permanent confession. And as I closed the door, I saw Dad's sedan already missing and remembered his late-night text about the envelope, which meant that somewhere between the oatmeal he prefers and the paper he reads despite pretending the news is too biased to be useful, he had unfolded the pages I sent and felt. If not the old pride I collected like bottle caps as a kid, then at least the destabilizing awareness that his mental map of his daughters had never included the right legend. It was not spite that made me mail those documents. It was the clean logic that arrives when you realize you have been playing a role in a pageant that cast you without ever asking if you were available, because the file I compiled, tidy as a school report without the ribbon, contained the appraisal with the notes about the roof that passed inspection without complaint, the closing statement with a down payment that came from savings and not a parental line of credit, the transfer from a brokerage account grown patiently from employer matches while I pretended I did not mind when holiday conversations turned to my sister's latest upgrade, and the modest letter from the bank confirming that the mortgage I chose is dull by design, fixed and friendly and immune to interest rate gossip, which means I sleep rather than speculate, and yes, there was a photocopy of my deed with the small rectangle of land described in those legal phrases that sound like a preacher reciting distances to heaven. Because papers like that do not just prove a point, they protect a piece you fought for. I had addressed the envelope to Dad, because he is the one who files things, a habit that used to make him feel like the foreman of our lives, and I knew that when he opened it. The quiet between him and Mom would vibrate in the particular way shared assumptions do when they discover they were not merely wrong, they were lazy, and I wanted that vibration not to punish, but to clarify, which is a distinction that sounds noble while still delivering the human satisfaction of finally seeing a truth land with the weight it deserves. And as I drove home, I thought of Haley and the frantic cheer in her voice when she described borrowing just enough to make the dream look bigger than the reality underneath it. And I pressed my lips together and wished her stability that fits, because I am not an enemy to her success, I am only allergic to the math that paid for it. At lunch, I met Lena, who twice now has lent me a drill and the kind of advice you can only give after stripping a screw at the worst possible time, and we ate at the small diner that survives on eggs, kindness, and the regulars who know to bring cash. And I told her about the tables, the undersides, the envelope, and the look on Mom's face when she picked up that coaster and turned it over like a shell that might still hold the ocean, and Lena laughed into her coffee and said that sometimes petty is just another word for precise, then reached for my hand and asked, without any drama, what I needed next, which is the kind of question that rearranges the furniture in your chest, because the honest answer was not champagne or applause. It was a plan that kept me from getting drawn back into the gravitational pull of a family orbiting the wrong star. So I drew that plan on a napkin while the waitress refilled our cups with the care of a practice nurse, listing steps in a loop rather than a ladder, because ladders still imply an audience looking up. And the loop began with paying off the last of a stubborn credit balance that had lingered out of sheer habit, rolled through a quiet appointment with a notary to update beneficiaries in a way that made my future less dependent on shared last names, and curved toward something I had been circling for months, converting the extra bedroom into a studio that could house a small, tidy business I had been building nights and weekends, the kind that sells competence rather than charm and could, if run correctly, Make the uncles who measure success in square footage ask careful questions in subdued tones. By the time I finished the napkin, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I still have saved as home, even though the place it refers to has not felt like home since the year I returned from college and found my room rebuilt as a guest space with towels folded like swans. And the text was brief in the way a bridge looks brief when it spans a canyon. A neat sentence from Dad asking if we could talk after dinner because there were some papers he wanted me to walk them through, which means he had read them, or at least looked at the numbers long enough to know they were not negotiable, and beneath the surface of his politeness, I could feel the slow turning of a long-rusted hinge. And as the waitress slid the check across the table, I realized with a steadiness that felt almost like relief that tonight would become another scene in which I kept my voice low while the truth did the heavy lifting, and that somewhere between the front hall and the kitchen table there would be a smile. That did not make it to the finish line. Evening settled over their kitchen with that soft, yellow insistence that makes every appliance look like it belongs to a kinder decade, and as I stepped inside with the same reflexive politeness I have carried since grade school, Dad motioned toward the table already set with placemats we only ever used for conversations that hoped to behave, while Mom hovered near the stove stirring a pot with more focus than the recipe required, the way she does when she needs the spoon to speak for her. And before I even took my seat, he produced the envelope as if it were a live thing that had been breathing under the stack of mail, then slid the documents out in careful order, the appraisal on top, the closing statement next, the deed at the bottom like bedrock. And he began to ask questions in a tone so measured it could hold water, except the questions were not really about square footage or payment schedules, they were about the architecture of a story he had told himself, a multi-year narrative in which I was the daughter who chose to rent her life by the month, and it was strange to watch his face edit itself as he read, deleting old captions while the photographs stayed the same. I answered with the patience of a person who has rehearsed for a test no one believed she would take, describing the inspection timeline and the laughably pragmatic mortgage that would bore an actuary, explaining how the down payment grew not from a windfall or a secret benefactor, but from the 1,000 little choices that make a person serious, like bringing lunch to work and mending a coat instead of replacing it. And at the corner of my vision, I could feel Mom stiffen in that way she has when she realizes a conversation is walking somewhere she did not intend to visit, because the math did not leave room for her favorite story about me, the one where independence is just a costume for stubbornness. And when she finally set the spoon down and asked why I had not told them sooner, I told the truth that always sounds like rudeness when spoken to people who assumed they deserved a front row seat, which is that I did not need another audience grading my choices and requesting rewrites. Before the paint was dry, she bristled, then smoothed the bristle with a compliment that carried too many qualifiers to be mistaken for love, praising my thrift in the same breath she used to praise Haley's boldness, as if thrift and boldness were spirit animals that never share the same forest. And I felt the familiar heat rise, not the furious kind that burns bridges, but the precise kind that spot welds resolve, so I smiled and offered tea and asked if we might look at the last page together, the one that lists the happy, dull phrase paid in full under a small debt I had eliminated last week, a footnote that mattered only because it freed exactly enough monthly breath to fund the studio I was building, a studio whose existence I mentioned as casually as weather. And both of them blinked in unison, two seasoned performers forgetting a line they have delivered for years, because the idea that I might be building not just a home, but a business did not fit on the shelf where they keep my file. The conversation might have floated there, careful and neutral like a boat that refuses the current, but the door swung open and Haley walked in without knocking, cheeks flushed with the heat of evening and the brittle stamina of someone narrating triumph while quietly auditing losses. And she launched into a breathless monologue about a contractor who promised to fix a roof leak that turned out to be not a leak, but a thesis on gravity, about an insurance adjuster who spoke in riddles, about a mortgage payment that would be manageable if the refrigerator would stop reciting warnings like a rookie prophet, and when she finally inhaled, she saw the papers on the table and the tidy rows of numbers she recognizes only when they belong to someone else. And the temperature in the room changed with the speed of a weather app, because there is nothing like proof of a sibling's solvency to make a favored child feel like a cautionary tale. Mom leapt to soothe Haley while simultaneously throwing me a look that begged for discretion, that desperate little glance mothers often reserve for family secrets that have not yet chosen their volume, and I could have offered silence as a peace offering. Yet I had spent years bartering silence for very little return, so I asked the simplest, kindest questions in a voice that refused to sharpen. Had the inspection been independent or bundled through the seller? Had she sought a second quote on the repairs? Had she considered pausing the ornamental purchases until the structural ones stopped bleeding? And each question landed with the slight thud of common sense, not as an accusation but as a mirror. And Haley bristled because mirrors are impolite when you are not ready to look, then snapped that not everyone is lucky enough to have cash on hand for emergencies, a sentence that tried to make my work sound like weather, and Dad cleared his throat again in that old way. Except this time. The vibration carried a new note I recognized, the sound of a man who has finally admitted to himself that his good intentions have been voting for the wrong budget. My revenge, if you want to call it that, did not show its teeth. It simply opened its hand, because I mentioned, with the idle air of someone who read it on a flyer, that the city's housing clinic offers a free consultation night for new owners dealing with exactly her list of miseries, and that a friend of mine on the neighborhood council could slot Haley in this week if she wanted an advocate to translate contractor language into English, and, while I watched Haley weigh the insult she wanted to feel against the relief she might accept, I also watched Mom calculate how to reframe this as a family triumph rather than an indictment of years of selective generosity, and I let them have the reframe, because the point was not to prove a moral. It was to move a problem towards solvable, and if that movement happens under a banner that flatters them, I can live with it, since I am keeping better records now and the records do not care what the banner says. We ate in a tentative quiet after that, the kind that follows a narrowly avoided fender bender, and when the plates were cleared I placed a small folder on the table, another neat parcel with a neutral name, and told Dad that inside he would find the paperwork to transfer the battered savings bond he has been keeping in the fireproof box since the year I learned to spell my name, a forgotten relic he planned, I am sure, to cash for Haley's next emergency on the grounds that she has more emergencies, and I said that since he had intended it for me back when fairness was a concept rather than a museum piece, I would like to move it to a different lockbox at my bank. Not because I needed the money now, but because I needed the symbol of it to live where promises are kept, and he hesitated just long enough to let the old habit try to win, then nodded with a small shamefaced dignity that felt like a hinge finally accepting oil. And Mom swallowed whatever argument she was assembling. Because Haley was watching, and the optics were suddenly inconvenient. When I stood to leave, I thanked them for the tea and for reading with open eyes even if the reading stung, and I kissed Mom's cheek and felt the tension there like static that refuses to ground. And Dad walked me to the door the way men used to walk daughters out to check that the night is behaving, and in the hall he said, careful as if the sentence were glass, that he had been too proud of the wrong things for too long. Then added that he would pick me up tomorrow morning because he wanted to see the house with his own eyes, not as a document but as a place, and before I could answer my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number containing a photograph of my front porch taken from the sidewalk, the light on, a single shoe left beside the doormat that was not mine, and a message that read, we should talk about who you did invite last night, which is how I learned that revenge, even when served at room temperature and plated with manners, has a way of inviting guests you never expected to meet. Morning came with the pale steadiness of a promise kept, and while I dressed in the kind of clothes that can tolerate dust and decision-making, I reread the text with the porch photo and the single abandoned shoe that did not belong to me. Noticing the angle of the shot, the slight tilt that always happens when someone hurries, then answered with the courtesy that survives even in the presence of barbed questions, asking who was writing and whether the shoe was theirs, and the reply arrived from a number that, once I searched my memory, revealed itself as belonging to Haley's boyfriend, who wrote in a tone that tried to pass for casual curiosity that he had driven by after my open house out of what he described as concern and what I read as reconnaissance, that he had seen someone from my family climb the porch steps. that there had been voices on the other side of the door, and that the shoe had rolled under the bench when the person left in a hurry, which meant the evening had carried observers and fugitives, and that the currency of rumor was already minting itself, all of which I folded into a pocket of patience I reserve for days that ask me to conduct 6 symphonies at once. Dad pulled up earlier than planned and stood on the sidewalk with the careful gravity of a man arriving at a place he would like to treat as a museum, but knows is a home. And when I opened the door, he looked past me the way people do when they are trying to adjust an old map to a new landscape. Then, without commentary, noticed the shoe on the bench and bent to pick it up, weighing it in his hand as if shoes communicate their owner's intentions, which, in a way, they do, because this one was a shade of polite beige that tries to hide in any room and carried on its sole a little burr of gravel that only sticks when someone leaves in a hurry, and he turned it once, twice, then slipped it into the grocery bag he had brought with muffins and said, in a voice that hoped for and dreaded the answer, that he thought he recognized the size and the scuff, which told me everything I needed to know about last night's uninvited visitor and the way guilt creates clumsiness where grace cannot survive. I walked him through the rooms at a pace that let the house speak for itself, because the point was not to sell him anything, it was to let him witness the sturdiness he had not found room for in his version of me. And he trailed his fingers along the windowsills the way he used to examine the edges of school projects, asking questions that sat on the right side of curiosity, how I had chosen the contractor who redid the railing, why the cheaper stove had made more sense than the showpiece, where I had found the patient neighbor who lent me a ladder without unsolicited advice, and when we reached the extra room that would become the studio, he stood at the threshold for a long stretch of seconds and said that the space looked like work and not theater, then asked, with the humility that can only grow in the shadow of old certainty, whether I would mind if he came back next weekend with a circular saw and a promise to be directed, and I told him that instruction would be a kindness to us both, since I am, at this point in my life, quite comfortable telling a parent where the studs are. While he measured the alcove with a tape he keeps in his jacket like a relic, my neighbor from the council arrived with a folder that contained the housing clinic appointment I had secured for Haley, printed on unforgiving municipal paper that flattens drama into times and room numbers, and I saw Dad's eyes move from my name on the deed pinned to the corkboard to Haley's name on the schedule and back again. And in that small circuit, a decade of allocation recalculated itself, so when he asked softly whether I expected him to deliver the folder and the shoe or whether I wanted to do it myself, I said that I wanted him to carry both, not as a messenger but as a father, and to say nothing extra. Just to set them on the kitchen table that has seen more elaborate theater than any stage I could rent, because some truths travel best when unadorned, and he nodded like a man made honest by necessity, then tucked the folder beneath his arm and the shoe into the bag with muffins, as if pairing nourishment with discomfort might teach them to coexist. I had one more parcel to prepare before we drove back, a square box that once held the engraved coasters and now held 2 of my own, fresh and untested, the stone etched with a different sentence. Not for the daughter who invites herself, but for the people who are allowed to come when there is work, and between them a small brass key tied to a strip of muslin and tagged with a neat card. The key belonging to a modest storage unit I had rented not for secrets, but for solutions, a place where, as of yesterday, sat a stack of materials priced by patience rather than prestige, patches for roofing shingles, sealant for stubborn seams, a basic kit that can outlast a hiccup of weather, a borrowed dehumidifier labeled with my number and the word return by fall, and a ledger where anyone who opened the unit would sign and take what they needed and bring back what they could. Because I decided that if I was going to be accused of hoarding competence, I would do it publicly and with a checkout sheet. At my parents' house, Mom opened the door with the hospitality she saves for moments that require optics, her smile brittle enough to cut fruit and her eyes jumping between Dad's face and the bag in his hand. And he went straight to the table and placed the shoe on one coaster and the clinic folder on the other, then set the box between them like a peace offering made of work, and in the brief silence that followed I heard the clatter of their private arithmetic, the sums of unspoken Expectations colliding with receipts, and when Haley came down the hall in socks and a sweatshirt too warm for the weather, her shoulders lifted and dropped as if she were trying to step out of a sweater sewn from pride and panic. And she picked up the shoe with the complicated relief of someone finding both an answer and a question, then read the clinic page without looking at me, then opened the box and turned the key over in her hand like a coin she might spend on something better than a story. Mom asked, carefully and with more curiosity than accusation, whether the key was an invitation or a test, and I said that it was neither and both, that it opened a place where we could all do something less symbolic than arguing over who deserved to be invited to a porch, that I would be at the unit on Saturday morning with a list and a thermos and no patience for bystanders, that anyone who arrived would be counted as mine, and that I would not take a roll call because the work would be the attendance and her fork, because yes, somehow there is always a fork in her hand when sentences like that land, slipped and made its tiny confession on the plate, and she said that she would bring towels, which is her way of saying she needs to warm up to the idea of labor, and Dad said he would bring the saw, and Haley said she would bring her contractor if he would show, and I said that I would bring the ledger, because fairness likes ink. When I walked out to the porch, the air felt like a page turning slowly enough to read, and Dad followed long enough to ask, in a voice that finally trusted plain words, whether I would consider moving the storage unit into the garage someday. And I laughed in the complicated way children laugh when a parent offers a gesture that might be evolution or theater, then said that garages, like tables, remember what has been written on them and that we could revisit the idea after a season of work. And he nodded as if he understood, or at least wanted to, and I drove home with the porch photo still open on my phone and the sense that I had just drawn a border that did not shriek but would hold, and in the late evening, when the porch light flicked on of its own accord and my neighbor's cat conducted her patrol, I took out the last engraved coaster, the one I had not given them, and set my glass on it, reading the words even though I knew them by heart, then looked at the door where the shoe had rolled and understood that sometimes revenge is not a door slamming but a door frame measured, leveled, and left for others to decide whether to walk through, which is not closure in the cinematic sense, but it is power. And if you were waiting for me to say whether they showed up on Saturday, I can only tell you that the ledger has pages and I have pens, and the key fits the lock, and the light will be on.